A while back, I did a video covering one of my favorite games, Caravan Beast. I mentioned at the end that although I love it, it isn't my favorite game by Goody Gameworks. So, what is? Ark of Templar is not just my favorite Goody Gameworks game, not just one of my favorite Flash games, but one of my favorite games in general. I know that's probably a bit of a wild statement, but I love this game to death despite its flaws. Before we get into all that, let's dial it back a bit. What is Ark of Templar? Ark of Templar is... I'm not exactly sure how to describe it. I think the best way to describe it would be wave defense. There's a horde of enemies that come in waves, and you have to stop them from killing you. There are 3 areas: the castle hall, the courtyard, and the castle gate, each of which have 7 levels. The progression is linear, unlocking the next level after beating the previous one, but you can go back and replay any level whenever. The enemies aren't usually too complicated. They have a set amount of health which can be seen in the bestiary, and a pop-up appears on screen whenever you encounter a new one to see how much health they have and damage they do. Some enemies have armor above their normal health, which is mostly the same as regular health, except you don't do any damage to their normal health bar until the armor's gone and they don't get one-shot by the first trap. Killing enemies also rewards you with experience, used for leveling up your Templar. I'm going to explain this now so that certain things make more sense later. There are 3 relics in the game which provide you with a buff to your Templar. They can be a little bit hard to find if you don't know how to get them, so I'll explain. The first is the King's Crown, which has 2 parts to it. Once you beat the Castle Hall, a coin appears on the bookcase to the left of the menu. Clicking it gives you the first half. Then once you beat 2-4, one of the portraits on the right will have a crown. Clicking it gives you the second half. The King's Relic is the best one because it revives you when you die. It says only once every level, but it can activate multiple times per level, so I think it might just have a cooldown. Either way, it sounds a lot more overpowered than it is, though it's still really good. Once you beat the courtyard, going back to 2-4 shows a horse chess piece. Clicking it gives you the unicorn relic, which will make a unicorn occasionally bombard the battlefield and do a lot of damage to the enemies. The squirrel relic is obtained by clicking the rabbit that sometimes appears on the menu for the castle gate, but it's bugged on Flashpoint and doesn't actually give you it, so I don't remember what it does. Before we get into the character you play as, let's talk about captains. Captains are allies that also fight enemies, and some can support you in other ways. You get the first captain after beating 1-1, the second after beating 2-4, and the final one after beating 3-3. They also level up, which either unlocks new abilities or upgrades previous ones. For example, let's look at the Bladeling, one of the first 2 choices you have. At level 6 it gets the ability to summon 1 clone, and the amount of clones it can have active at once increases with levels up to a maximum of 3 clones. Now we have probably the most interesting part of the game. Hue. At the beginning you choose either the Striker or the Color Mage, and that will be your main Templar for the rest of the game. You level up by killing enemies, which increases your maximum health as well as giving you a skill point. Skill points are used to either learn new skills or upgrade existing skills. Skills are essentially your attacks and abilities. You have 5 skill slots, which are the skills you take into the levels, though you can have points in skills you don't take into levels as well. Some skills are passive, which means you don't need to equip them, and you unlock more skills the higher level you are. Once you're actually in battle, to use skills you have to use the number keys from 1 to 5, though certain skills are instead used automatically once you're off cooldown. Speaking of, each skill has a cooldown before you can use it again. The Color Mage is a mage, big shocker I know, who channels the powers of fire, ice, and lightning to defeat the enemies. I describe the Color Mage as having less consistency but more burst. This is reflected in the leveling, where instead of getting a few good spells every few levels, you get massive power spikes, the biggest one being at level 28, and the 3 skills you get at that level. Chain Lightning and Fire Spirits are pretty good, but the big one is Tundra Beast. The Tundra Beast summons a Tundra Beast, how surprising, that independently attacks enemies, sort of like a bonus captain. It has a 30-second cooldown, but the cooldown ticks down while the beast is active, so it's more like a 5-second cooldown. All this, and it only costs a single skill point to max out, which is pretty bonkers. The Striker opts for a different approach than the Color Mage, using weaponry over magic. I'd say the Striker has less insane power spikes, but is more consistent overall. Your first spell is a rifle attack that simply shoots automatically every half a second. This can be upgraded from 1 damage to 1.7 damage for the spell itself, but other spells can buff it further, such as allowing it to shoot 2 shots at once. I can't really say which Templar is better, because they're both good. Color Mage probably has an easier late game once you get the Tundra Beast, but Striker is both a bit easier to use and has a slightly smoother early and mid game while still doing great in the late game, so choose whichever one interests you more. As I mentioned earlier, there are 3 areas that each have 7 levels. Each area has different enemies, a different boss at the end, and a different trap that can be used to help kill the enemies. So, let's get into them. This is the first area, and home of the blobs. It only really has 6 levels since the first one is the tutorial, but I think it's pretty fair. The enemies are all various forms of slimes. The biggest threats to worry about are probably the big armored guys who have 50 health and don't get one shot by the trap if they still have their armor, and the purple guys who can shoot you from the other side of the screen even if you have walls still up. Aside from the right side of the screen, there's also a door at the top that enemies can come out of. It's pretty much just the weak blue and green slimes though, so they aren't really too much of an issue. The trap in this area is a net chandelier thing that falls down from the ceiling. It does enough damage to insta-kill every enemy apart from the orange slimes when they have armor, and the boss. Speaking of, the boss. The boss is the Slime King who has 700 health you need to chunk through. He stays stationary except for when he does his jump attack where he launches himself in the air and lands on either you or your captain. He also has an attack where he can spit slime on both you and your captain, which completely immobilizes both of you. He can also summon groups of the other enemies as well. So the castle gate is the final area, but I want to leave the courtyard for last because we'll tackle that when the time comes. Anyways, the castle gate is, as I said, the final area, and home of the demons. There's honestly not too many huge threats in this area aside from the final boss. Every enemy can be a little bit annoying, from the demon that can teleport on top of you to the ones who can eat your captains, stopping them from doing anything for a while, but nothing too overly challenging to deal with. Trap for this area doesn't help with that, since it pretty much just obliterates every enemy on screen that's not the final boss. Speaking of, the final boss is the Demon King. He had the potential to be quite a challenge, having 3 different faces that all have more health than the last. The second and the third face can also put up a shield that makes him invincible and he heals himself for a bit. The whole area could have been pretty difficult, except for the last couple stages. They added a second tile. What does that tile do, you ask? Nothing much, it just makes you completely immune to all damage. Yeah. But it comes at the cost of freezing your skill cooldowns, which really isn't that big of a deal, especially since your captains can still attack. It's so easy to abuse this tile, and is present for the final boss, so it just becomes a game of using the tile to dodge attacks. I complain, but it can be fun. Overall, I do like this area. It's a fun victory lap. Anyways, that's all the areas. All 2 of them. Yep. No more. Fine. It's time to talk about the courtyard. So, the courtyard. It's something. And by that, I mean it's the hardest area in the game by far. To be fair, it could just be because it's bugged on Flashpoint so the trap doesn't do anything, but even back when I used to play it on armor games I remember it being hard. So first, let's talk about the enemies. This is the home of the skeletons and ghosts, because that's what one enemy is. What are the biggest threats? What aren't the biggest threats is the question. The easiest enemy is probably the basic skeleton knight, though even it's a bit of a challenge since it has armor and moves fairly quickly once it's gone. The Banes are probably the second easiest since they sit at the back and have a pretty long wind-up for their attack, so they aren't too difficult to dodge. Everything else can be really hard to deal with though, especially the burning skeletons. The burning skeletons function similar to the purple slimes from the first area, since they stay further back and launch arcane projectiles that always target you. Aside from the increased stats, there are 3 things that make them more difficult. The first is that the fire lingers for a couple seconds wherever they hit, so you need to avoid that spot. The second is that they first appear on the first level, so you need to deal with them throughout the whole area. Because of this, the third thing happens, the sheer number that you have to deal with, which brings me to why the area is so hard. This area is probably the highest concentration of enemies of all of them. This makes single target attacks a lot worse, because you can't focus on one enemy at a time when there's 30 on screen. Even then, there's only 2 enemies that need to be in melee range to attack, and one of them moves incredibly fast and is immune to both the ways you have to stun enemies at this point, which makes it not that much of a hindrance. The biggest difficulty spike is 2-4, with 2-3 also able to be a big challenge sometimes. You do get a break with 2-5, as well as gaining access to the King's Relic at this point. 2-6 goes right back to being incredibly difficult. And then there's the boss. The boss is 3 pillars, all of which having their own separate health bars and having different attacks. The bottom pillar is the biggest threat, since it spawns extra enemies. The top pillar is probably the easiest attack to dodge, though sometimes the hitbox can be a bit weird and does a lot of damage if you do get hit by it. The middle pillar wouldn't be too bad if it weren't for the regular enemy attacks that cause you to need to move around a lot. Speaking of, there's still normal enemies that spawn a lot more than in either of the other bosses. Overall, this area is my least favorite part of the game. It would be probably fine if the number of enemies were toned down, but as it stands, beating 2-7 is basically beating the rest of the game. Okay, after that monstrosity, let's try and look back a bit. Why do I love this game so much? The gameplay is actually really fun at its core, and the skill tree system adds a fun layer of customizability. The Striker does have a bit more freedom in choosing what to use rather than having direct upgrades, but the Color Mage does have some decisions too. Having to choose which captains to use also adds another layer to that, which is pretty nice. The music and sound effects are also really good. It's mostly one soundtrack which plays for every level, but it's good enough and the game is short enough that I don't mind. And then the art. I absolutely love it. This shouldn't be much of a surprise if you've seen these videos. I really like this style of pixel art. The colors and shading all look really nice, nothing looks wrong, it's great. And then there's the character designs, which I really like pretty much all of them. Even my least favorite ones are designs that I'm neutral on rather than actually disliking them. Everything comes together to make the game just so aesthetically pleasing. The biggest flaw I do have with the game is that grinding is pretty much essential for beating the second area, which can be pretty tedious. Other than that though, I really don't have anything negative to say about the game. I absolutely adore it, and it'll probably remain one of my favorite games for a long time. Well, that's about all I got. I would really recommend at least giving the game a try if you can, and it interests you at all. It's free, so what do you gotta lose? Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, cool. Glad I can make your day at least a little bit better. Bye.